Chapter 11, we only cover Section 1, and that deals with markdowns. So Chapter 10, we dealt with how do they price their products, mark it up to sell it and make a profit and cover their operating expenses. Now maybe the season's over and they need to mark those products down. So we'll determine how much can they mark it down to not take an operating loss. We have a couple formulas that we use in here. So our reduced price is our original price minus our markdown. And then our markdown is always a percent times our original price. Or the problem may ask what type of a percentage it is. So then our percent will be equal to our markdown divided by our original price. So those are kind of the basics of the formula. These two are just kind of rearranged. But so say, for instance, if we have a problem that says an oak desk that is originally priced $837.50, so that's our original selling price, is reduced to $686.75. So find the percent of the markdown on that original price. So if we start up here, we say, okay, it's reduced to a price of $686.75. So that's my reduced selling price. The original price of this oak desk was $837.50. And then from that we would subtract our markdown. So really it's just the difference between those two. So if you take our $837.50 original selling price, subtract out the $686.75 reduced selling price, you would have a markdown dollar amount of $150.75. What the problem is asking for, though, is what percent of a markdown that is. So we go to that formula. So our percent is going to be our markdown of $150.75 divided by our original selling price. Not our reduced one, but our original one. So $837.50. So if we solve for that, 150.75 divided by 837.5 gives us 0.18 or 18%. So that is our markdown. I think the thing that maybe makes it a little bit easier than the last chapter is that it's always of original price. So like our last chapter, is it on cost or is it on selling price? Our markdown is always a percentage of our original price to determine that. Okay, then the second part of this section deals with calculating out whether we're having an operating loss or an absolute loss. So how we work that is we take our reduced selling price and then we subtract out our cost. And that is either going to give us profit if it's positive, or if it's negative, it's what they call an absolute loss. So what that is saying is that if our reduced selling price is not even covering our cost, we're losing money. So say we're a retailer and we bought a sweater for $10 and we end up having to sell it on the clearance rack for $6. Well, then we just lost $4 on the sale of that. Now from this, we still have to cover our operating expenses. So if we are a retailer, we still have to pay our clerks to run the cash registers. We still have to have electricity. We still have to pay rent. We still have to pay insurance. All those things still have to be paid. And then we'll subtract those from it and we'll end up with an operating loss. So if we're in a situation where we have an absolute loss and we subtract out those operating expenses, our operating loss is only going to get bigger. Okay, so then if we have a problem that tells us that There's Persian and Oriental Rug Gallery paid $2,211 for an imported rug from Iran. So that was their cost. Its operating expenses were 33.33% of cost. If it sells the rug at clearance price of $2,650, find the amount of profit or loss. So what they sold it at, the clearance price of $2,650, that's our reduced selling price. What they paid to get it was $2,211. So at least in this example, they sold it for more than what they paid to get it, so they do not have an absolute loss. They would have profit. Again, if this were a negative number, then that's what that absolute loss would be. Now then the operating expenses we have to calculate. It tells us that they are 33.33% of cost. So if I come down here and I take my cost of $2,211 and I multiply that by 33.33%, or 0.3333, I get $736 and it's $36 and it's 0.99999. So I'm going to round that up to $737. So then now I'll plug that up here. So I made $430 on the sale of this rug on clearance, but I still have to cover my operating costs of $737. So when I subtract those, then I will have a $298 operating loss. So in a sense, that's like kind of a little mini income statement. So it's a good concept to be comfortable with. And then most of the ones we're going to calculate, you'll have that operating loss. You may even have an absolute loss. Okay, then the third and final computation that we do in this chapter, or in this section of the chapter, it says, okay, if we know we have to mark down a product, how much can we mark it down without taking that operating loss? So without having that go negative. So what that's saying is we want to cover our cost and we want to cover those operating expenses. So the only thing that we could get rid of if we're not going to take an operating loss is our net profit. So then we've got a scenario that we have a photo supply retailer pays $190 for an enlarger. The store's operating expenses are 20% of cost and its net profit is 15% of cost. So we've got cost of $190. We have a 20% to cover operating costs. And then we've got 15% to provide for net profit. So then it says to find the original selling price of the enlarger, and then the maximum percent markdown that can be given without taking that operating loss. So again, we have to cover our cost, and we have to cover these operating costs in order to not take a loss. So this is the only piece that we can get rid of, or that we can reduce. Without taking an operating loss. So then that's kind of the key. So then now if we come back to our regular formula from Chapter 10, our selling price is equal to our cost of $190 plus our markup. And then remember from Chapter 10, we have to add those together. So we have a 35% markup. So if I put that into my formula, I've got to save some space, so I'm going to do it all on one. If I multiply what I have here, my 35% times my cost of $190, I have a markup dollar amount of $66.50. I add that back to my cost to get a total selling price of $256.50. So that was the first thing it asked for. What is our original selling price? So that's this one. Okay. Then we want to know, well, what percent can we mark it down without taking an operating loss? So I know that this is the piece I can mark it down. So my markdown dollar amount is going to be 15% or 0.15 times my cost of $190. So that's a $28.50 markdown. But again, dollar amount. That's not what the problem's asking for. The problem wants to know, well, what percentage is that? So if I turn that into a percent, then I have to take my $28.50 and divide it by my original selling price of $256.50. So $28.50 divided by $256.50 gives me 0.111 or 11.1%. So then that's my final answer. So my final answer is the percentage. But you have to do all three of these steps to get to this, because this is ultimately the formula that you want to solve for. So you want to say, what's my markdown dollar amount divided by my original selling price? So I have to determine what my original selling price is first. I also have to determine what's the maximum dollar amount of my markdown, and then I can put that into a percentage form. So then that is the third computation that we have in this section. And that is what we will cover in Chapter 11.